Girl whispered, "Father, my stepfather hurts me, but everyone thinks he's a saint." When she named him, I froze because he was A. I am Pastor David Clark, and for 15 years, I have had the profound privilege of serving the congregation of Bright Hope Community Church. When I first arrived here, fresh from seminary with idealistic dreams and a heart full of passion for the gospel, this church was struggling to survive with barely 50 members. Through God's grace and the faithful commitment of our people, we have grown into a thriving community of nearly 200 souls. My wife Sarah often jokes that I fell in love with this place before I fell in love with her, though thankfully, I managed both within the same year. We have two wonderful children, Michael, now 16, and already showing signs of his own calling to ministry, and Rebecca, 14, and blessed with her mother's compassionate heart. They have grown up in these halls, and this congregation has been more than a church to us. It has been our family. In our community, I am known as the pastor who always has time to listen. Whether it's Mrs. Collins needing someone to sit with her during her chemotherapy treatments, or young couples seeking guidance before marriage, or teenagers wrestling with questions that their parents can't answer, my door is always open. I've learned that sometimes the most powerful sermons are preached not from the pulpit, but in the quiet moments when one heart opens to another. That evening, as I was preparing to lock up and head home to Sarah's pot roast, I heard the gentle knock that would forever change the trajectory of my ministry. It wasn't the confident rap of someone arriving for a scheduled appointment, but the tentative tap of someone who wasn't entirely sure they should be there at all. When I opened the door, I found Emma Harrison standing in the rain. Emma, 21 years old, beautiful in that wholesome way that makes church mothers proud, and one of our most faithful young people. She had grown up in our youth group, served faithfully in our children's ministry, and was pursuing a degree in elementary education at the local community college. Everyone expected great things from Emma. She was the kind of young woman that parents pointed to when they told their daughters, "Why can't you be more like Emma Harrison?" But the Emma standing at my door that night was not the composed, confident young woman we all knew. Her clothes were soaked through, her long brown hair plastered to her face, and her hands trembled as she clutched a small umbrella that had clearly given up the fight against the storm. What struck me most, however, were her eyes. Eyes that usually sparkled with joy and mischief now held a depth of pain that no 21-year-old should have to carry. "Pastor Clark," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rain, "I need to talk to you. Please. It's important." I immediately ushered her inside, offering her a warm towel and a cup of coffee from the pot I always kept brewing during evening hours. As she settled into the chair across from my desk, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten with concern. Faint bruises around her wrists, barely visible but unmistakable to someone who had done crisis counseling for as long as I had. "Emma, dear child, what's troubling you?" I asked gently, settling into my pastoral role while silently praying for wisdom. She stared at her hands for what felt like an eternity before speaking. When she finally looked up, tears were streaming down her face. "Pastor, I don't know how to say this. I don't know if you'll believe me, but I can't carry this alone anymore." I leaned forward, using the voice I had developed over years of counseling hurting souls. "Emma, you can tell me anything. Whatever burden you're carrying, we can face it together with God's help." Her next words came out in a rush, as if she was afraid that hesitation would steal her courage entirely. "My stepfather, he hurts me, Pastor, not just emotionally, but physically. He controls everything I do, everywhere I go, and my mother—" Her voice broke. "My mother hits me too. She says it's my fault, that I bring it on myself, that I'm ungrateful for everything they've done for me." The blood in my veins seemed to turn to ice. In 15 years of ministry, I had encountered domestic violence before, but hearing it from someone so close to our church family was devastating. I wanted to reach out, to offer immediate comfort, but something in her demeanor told me there was more. Something even worse was coming. "Emma," I said carefully, "I'm so sorry you're going through this. No one deserves to be treated that way. Can you tell me, who is it that's hurting you?" She took a shuddering breath, and I could see her gathering every ounce of courage she possessed. When she spoke his name, my world tilted on its axis. Robert Harrison. The words hit me like a physical blow. Robert Harrison, pillar of our church, generous benefactor, leader of our men's ministry, and the man I had been planning to recommend for senior deacon at next month's board meeting. Robert, who organized our annual charity drives and had personally paid for the new roof on our sanctuary. Robert, who everyone in our congregation looked up to as an example of Christian manhood and family leadership. The silence stretched between us as I struggled to process what I had just heard. Emma watched my face, and I could see the fear creeping into her eyes. Fear that I wouldn't believe her. Fear that I would choose the church's reputation over her pain. "Pastor," she whispered, "please say something." I found myself at the crossroads of pastoral duty and moral obligation. Everything in my training told me to listen, to believe the victim, to offer immediate support and protection. But everything in my human nature recoiled at the idea that a man I had trusted, respected, and called friend could be capable of such evil. As I sat there in the lamplight of my office, with the rain still beating against the windows and this broken young woman waiting for my response, I realized I was facing the greatest moral crisis of my ministry. How could I reconcile the Robert Harrison who delivered food to shut-ins with the monster Emma was describing? How could I balance my duty to protect her with my obligation to be fair to a man who might be innocent? But looking into Emma's eyes that held no deception, only desperate hope that someone would finally believe her, I knew that my response in this moment would define not only her future, but the very nature of my calling as a shepherd of God's flock. "Emma," I said finally, my voice heavy with the weight of what was to come, "I believe you, and we're going to figure out how to help you through this." What happened next would test every principle I held dear about confidentiality, loyalty, and the sometimes terrible cost of standing for truth. The revelation Emma shared with me that night was only the beginning of a story so shocking, so heart-wrenching, and so ultimately redemptive that it would transform our entire church community forever. But that, my friends, is a story that will challenge everything you think you know about the nature of evil, the power of forgiveness, and the sometimes unbearable weight of doing what's right when the whole world seems to be telling you you're wrong. That night, after Emma left my office with a promise to meet again in 2 days, I found myself unable to go home. Instead, I remained in the sanctuary, drawn to the altar where I had knelt countless times seeking the Lord's guidance. The familiar scent of old wood and lingering traces of Sunday's flowers surrounded me as I wrestled with what I had just heard. I want you to understand the depth of my calling to this place and these people. My journey to ministry wasn't a straight path. It was forged in the crucible of personal crisis. 20 years ago, I was a different man. I worked in corporate finance, chasing success and material gain, until a devastating car accident took my younger brother and left me questioning everything I thought I knew about life's meaning and God's purpose. It was in that dark valley of grief that I encountered the living Christ. Not in some dramatic vision, but in the quiet faithfulness of Pastor William Henderson, who visited me daily in the hospital and never once offered easy answers or religious platitudes. Instead, he simply sat with me in my pain and showed me what it meant to be present in someone's darkest hour. That experience ignited a fire in my soul that eventually led me to seminary and ultimately to this congregation. When I arrived at Bright Hope 15 years ago, I found a community hungry for authentic spiritual leadership. The previous pastor had been more administrator than shepherd, and the flock was scattered and discouraged. But God had planted something special in this soil. Within these walls, I discovered families who had been attending for generations, their roots running deep into the foundation of this community. The Harrison family had been among the founding members 25 years earlier. Robert's late father, Samuel Harrison, had been instrumental in purchasing the land and building our original sanctuary. When Samuel passed away 10 years ago, Robert stepped seamlessly into his father's role as one of our most influential leaders. He possessed that rare combination of business acumen and genuine heart for service that makes a church thrive. I remember the day Robert married Linda Thompson, Emma's mother. It was one of the most beautiful ceremonies I had ever performed. Linda had been a single mother, struggling to raise 8-year-old Emma after her first husband abandoned them. Robert seemed like an answer to prayer, stable, successful, and eager to provide the family structure that Linda and Emma had been missing. Emma had been just a child then, but even at 8 years old, she possessed a remarkable spirit. She was curious about everything, always asking profound questions during children's church that made me smile and think. "Pastor David," she once asked me, "if God loves everybody, why do some daddies leave their little girls?" The innocence and pain in that question had stayed with me all these years. Watching her grow up had been one of the great joys of my ministry. She excelled in everything she touched: academics, music, community service. When she turned 16, she began helping with our children's ministry, and I often marveled at her natural ability to connect with the younger ones. She had a gift for making complex biblical concepts accessible to young minds, and more than once, I found myself incorporating her creative teaching methods into my own lessons. But as I sat in that sanctuary, replaying the scene from my office, I began to remember things differently. Had there been signs I had missed? I thought about the gradual changes I had noticed over the past year. Emma's participation in youth activities had slowly declined. She had stopped volunteering for overnight retreats, claiming she had too much schoolwork. Her bright smile had become more forced, more careful. And Robert, how had I failed to see what now seemed so obvious? His devotion to the church had always impressed me. But had it actually been about control? The way he insisted on being involved in every decision, the subtle ways he managed to position himself at the center of every important conversation, the particular attention he paid to young families and their children, were these the actions of a servant leader or something more sinister? I found myself praying the prayer of Psalm 139. "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there is any offensive way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting." How could I have been so blind to the suffering happening right under my nose? The weight of Emma's revelation pressed down on me like a physical burden. Here was a young woman I had watched grow up, someone I cared about like my own daughter, telling me that the man I trusted as my right hand was destroying her life piece by piece. The sacred trust of the confessional meant that I couldn't simply act on her words, yet how could I stand by and do nothing? I thought about the parable of the Good Shepherd, how Jesus spoke of knowing his sheep by name and laying down his life for them. What did it mean to be a shepherd when one of your sheep was being devoured by a wolf that the rest of the flock saw as a fellow sheep? The parallel sent chills down my spine as I realized how perfectly it described my current dilemma. Sleep eluded me that night and the next. I found myself studying Emma's behavior during our Sunday service with new eyes. She sat with her family in their usual third-row pew. But now I noticed how she kept her head down during most of the worship, how she flinched slightly when Robert's hand fell on her shoulder during prayer time, how her mother Linda seemed to watch her every movement with nervous intensity. During the sermon, Ironically, I had planned to speak about families being sanctuaries of love. I watched Robert nod approvingly at my words about fathers being protectors and providers. To everyone else, he appeared to be the embodiment of the biblical principles I was teaching. But knowing what I now knew, his enthusiastic agreement felt like mockery of everything sacred. The second meeting with Emma, held in the privacy of my study after Wednesday evening service, revealed layers of complexity that made my heart ache. She was no longer the terrified young woman who had stood at my door in the rain. Instead, she displayed the kind of resigned strength that comes from enduring long suffering, a strength that no one her age should have to develop. "Pastor Clark," she began, settling into the chair across from my desk, "I want you to understand that I don't hate him." That probably sounds strange, but it's true. There are times when he's kind, when he seems like the man everyone thinks he is. That's what makes this so confusing. Her words revealed the insidious nature of psychological manipulation. Robert wasn't a cartoon villain. He was a complex human being who used his capacity for good to mask his capacity for harm. This made Emma's situation infinitely more complicated, and my own response more challenging. She described a pattern of control that had developed gradually over the years. It started with small things, questions about where she had been, requests to check her homework, insistence on driving her to and from social events for safety. Slowly, these reasonable-sounding restrictions had tightened into a web of surveillance and isolation. "He tells me he loves me like his own daughter," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper, "right before he explains why I need to be disciplined for disappointing him. And my mother—" Her voice trailed off, pain evident in every line of her face. Linda's role in this tragedy was perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of all. A woman who had found security and social standing through her marriage to Robert, she had gradually become complicit in her daughter's suffering, not out of malice, but out of fear. Fear of losing the stability she had craved for so long. As Emma shared more details, I found myself caught between my duty as her pastor and my obligations to the church community. The weight of keeping this secret felt crushing, yet I knew that breaking confidence without Emma's permission could put her in even greater danger. That night, alone in my study, I opened my Bible to the book of Ezekiel and read, "Son of man, I have made you a watchman for the people of Israel. So hear the word I speak, and give them warning from me." The words seemed to burn on the page as I contemplated their meaning for my current situation. I was beginning to understand that this crisis would test not only my skills as a counselor, but the very foundation of my faith and calling. The comfortable certainties of pastoral ministry were giving way to moral complexities that had no easy answers, no clear biblical precedents to follow. As I prepared for our next meeting, I couldn't shake the feeling that Emma's revelation was only the beginning. Something in her eyes, a deep well of pain that seemed far older than her 21 years, suggested that the full truth was even more devastating than what she had already shared. What I was about to discover would challenge everything I thought I knew about the nature of evil and force me to make choices that would forever change both my ministry and our church community in ways so shocking that even now, years later, I can barely believe how this story unfolded. The Sunday service following my second meeting with Emma was unlike any I had ever experienced. Standing behind the pulpit, looking out at the familiar faces of my congregation, I felt as though I was seeing everything through new eyes, eyes that had been opened to truths I wished I could unsee. There, in the third row as always, sat the Harrison family. Robert, impeccably dressed in his navy suit, arm draped protectively around Linda's shoulders. To any observer, they appeared to be the picture of Christian family values. But now I noticed things that had been invisible to me before. How Emma sat rigid beside them, hands folded tightly in her lap, never once looking up during the worship songs that had once brought such joy to her face. As I delivered my sermon on Psalm 23, "The Lord is my shepherd," I found myself stumbling over the words about walking through valleys and finding comfort. How could I speak of divine protection when one of my own sheep was being devoured by a wolf that sat in my congregation, nodding approvingly at my words? It was after that service that young Michael Thompson approached me. Michael had been dating Emma for nearly 2 years, and I had always appreciated his genuine character and steady devotion to her. But the young man who stood before me now carried worry lines that seemed far too deep for his 23 years. "Pastor Clark," he said, glancing around nervously to ensure we wouldn't be overheard, "I need to ask you something about Emma. As her pastor, maybe you've noticed. She's been different lately, distant. She cancels our dates at the last minute, always with some excuse about family obligations. When we do spend time together, she seems afraid, like she's constantly watching the clock, terrified of being late getting home." Michael's words confirmed what I already knew, but hearing them from someone else made the situation feel even more real, more urgent. Here was a young man who loved Emma deeply, yet he was completely unaware of the hell she was living through daily. The weight of my secret knowledge felt crushing as I looked into his earnest, concerned eyes. "Michael," I said carefully, "sometimes people go through difficult seasons. The best thing you can do is continue to be patient and supportive. Let Emma know that you're there for her, no matter what." The frustration in his eyes was evident. "But Pastor, it's like she's becoming a different person. The Emma I fell in love with was so vibrant, so full of dreams about teaching elementary school and maybe starting a family someday. Now she barely talks about the future at all. It's like she's given up hope for anything good." His words pierced my heart because I could see the truth in them. Emma wasn't just being controlled by Robert. Her very spirit was being systematically destroyed. The realization made me want to abandon all pastoral protocols and take immediate action, but I knew that without Emma's consent, any intervention could make her situation far worse. That week, as I made my usual rounds visiting church members, I began to notice other troubling patterns. At the nursing home, where Mrs. Collins was recovering from her hip surgery, I encountered Linda Harrison visiting her elderly aunt. What struck me was not her presence. Linda had always been dutiful about family obligations, but her appearance. Despite her carefully applied makeup, I could see the faint discoloration around her left eye, the way she favored her right arm when reaching for things. "Oh, Pastor Clark," she said, startled by my sudden appearance. "I was just leaving. Robert doesn't like me to stay out too long, especially with Emma needing supervision at home." The way she said supervision sent chills down my spine. What had once sounded like normal parental concern now carried sinister undertones. During our brief conversation, Linda mentioned that Emma had been clumsy lately, frequently bumping into things and falling down. "You know how it is with young people," she said with a forced laugh, "always rushing around, not paying attention to where they're going." But I knew better now. Those weren't accidents. They were evidence of a pattern of violence that had become so normalized within the Harrison household that Linda felt compelled to make excuses for injuries that should have raised immediate red flags. The most heartbreaking revelation came during an unexpected encounter with Emma's 12-year-old stepbrother, Danny, Linda's son from her first marriage. I found him sitting alone in the church playground after Wednesday evening service, long after the other children had been picked up by their parents. "Danny, where's your family?" I asked, settling beside him on the swing set where I had pushed him countless times when he was smaller. "Mom and Robert are talking to Deacon Phillips about the budget committee," he said quietly. "They told me to wait out here." As we talked, I noticed changes in Danny that I had attributed to normal adolescent development. But now, with heightened awareness, I recognized them as warning signs. His grades had been slipping, his teacher had mentioned behavioral problems, and he had become increasingly aggressive with younger children during church activities. Pastor David, he said suddenly, is it normal for families to be really quiet at home? Like, nobody talks much during dinner, and everyone tries to stay in their own rooms? The question broke my heart. This child was describing a household ruled by fear, where family members isolated themselves to avoid triggering Robert's anger. What makes you ask that, buddy? Danny kicked at the dirt beneath his feet. Sometimes I hear Emma crying at night, and Mom cries a lot too, but only when she thinks nobody's watching. I asked Emma what was wrong once, but she just told me to focus on my schoolwork and stay out of grown-up business. I realized then that Emma wasn't just protecting herself. She was trying to shield her younger stepbrother from the truth about their family dynamic. The burden she carried was even heavier than I had imagined, and the urgency of finding a way to help her increased exponentially. That night, I found myself on my knees in the sanctuary, wrestling with God, like Jacob at Peniel. Lord, I prayed, show me what to do. How can I honor the sacred trust of confession while protecting the innocent? How do I balance mercy with justice when both seem to require opposite actions? I turned to the book of Ezekiel, where God calls the prophet to be a watchman for his people. But if the watchman sees the sword coming and does not blow the trumpet to warn the people, and the sword comes and takes someone's life, that person's life will be taken because of their sin. But I will hold the watchman accountable for their blood. The passage felt like a direct challenge to my passivity. How many more people would suffer while I struggled with the ethics of confidentiality? How could I claim to be a shepherd if I allowed wolves to devour my flock while I stood by, bound by religious protocol? In my sermon the following Sunday, I chose to speak about Jesus' words in Matthew 18. If anyone causes one of these little ones, those who believe in me, to stumble, it would be better for them to have a large millstone hung around their neck and to be drowned in the depths of the sea. As I preached about the sacred responsibility to protect the vulnerable, I watched Robert's face carefully. For the first time since Emma's revelation, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Not guilt or remorse, but calculation. He was wondering if my message was directed at him, if somehow I had discovered his secret. After the service, Robert approached me with his usual confident smile, but I could sense the tension beneath it. "Powerful message today, Pastor," he said, gripping my hand just a little too firmly. "I hope our congregation takes seriously their responsibility to guard against outside influences that might threaten our young people." The veiled threat in his words was unmistakable. He was warning me to stay away from his family, to mind my own business. But what he didn't realize was that his barely concealed hostility only confirmed everything Emma had told me and strengthened my resolve to find a way to help her. As the weeks passed, I began to understand that the situation was far more complex and dangerous than I had initially realized. This wasn't just a case of one man's cruelty. It was a web of manipulation, control, and fear that had ensnared multiple victims and infected our entire church community with its poison. What I was about to discover would shatter my remaining illusions about the nature of evil hiding in plain sight and force me to make a choice that would forever change not just my ministry, but the lives of everyone I held dear, in ways so devastating and unexpected that even now, I struggled to believe what happened next. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in October, 3 weeks after my last conversation with Emma. I was preparing my sermon on forgiveness when my phone rang with the kind of call that every pastor dreads. "Pastor Clark, this is Dr. Sarah Martinez from Community General Hospital," the voice said urgently. "We have Emma Harrison here in the emergency room. She's been in an accident, and she's asking for you specifically." My blood turned to ice. As I rushed to the hospital, 1,000 fears raced through my mind. Had Robert's violence finally escalated beyond psychological control? Had Emma reached a breaking point that led her to harm herself? The 20-minute drive felt like an eternity as I prayed desperately for her safety. When I arrived at the hospital, I found Emma sitting on an examination table, her left arm in a sling, and her face bearing fresh bruises that makeup couldn't hide. But what shocked me most was the protective way she held her abdomen and the presence of Dr. Martinez speaking quietly with a nurse about prenatal care. "Pastor," Emma whispered when she saw me, tears streaming down her face, "I need to tell you something else. Something I should have said weeks ago." My heart just sank as the implications hit me. Emma was pregnant. In our conservative church community, this revelation would be scandalous enough, but given what I knew about her home situation, it represented a catastrophe beyond imagination. "How long have you known?" I asked gently, taking her uninjured hand in mine. 6 weeks, she said, her voice barely audible. "Pastor, I don't know what to do. I don't even know." She couldn't finish the sentence, but I understood. The question of paternity hung in the air like a poison cloud, too terrible to voice aloud. Dr. Martinez, who had been a member of our congregation for several years, approached us with professional compassion. "Pastor Clark, Emma has suffered a mild concussion and possible fractured ribs from what she describes as a fall down the stairs at home. Given her condition, I'm concerned about the stress she's under. Pregnancy complications can arise from both physical trauma and psychological distress." The doctor's words carried an unspoken question. She had seen too many accidents in her career not to recognize the signs of domestic violence, yet she couldn't act without Emma's cooperation or concrete evidence. After Dr. Martinez left us alone, Emma broke down completely. "Pastor, everyone's going to know soon. I can't hide this much longer. And when they find out," she shuddered, "our church, they'll think I'm some kind of fallen woman. They'll whisper about me, judge me, cast me out. And at home, Robert is already suspicious. He watches everything I do, monitors every phone call, controls every moment of my day." I realized then that Emma's pregnancy had created a ticking time bomb. In our traditional church community, an unmarried pregnancy would result in social ostracism and moral condemnation. But the deeper horror was that if Robert was indeed the father, Emma would be trapped forever in his web of abuse, bound to him by an innocent child who would become another victim in his house of horrors. "Emma," I said carefully, "have you considered that there might be other possibilities? Michael Thompson has been devoted to you for 2 years." Hope flickered in her eyes for just a moment before despair crushed it again. "I pray every night that it's Michael's child, Pastor, but the timing and Robert—" She couldn't finish, but the implication was clear. That afternoon, I made a decision that would haunt me for years to come. I drove to the office of Bishop William Crawford, my former seminary professor and spiritual mentor. If anyone could help me navigate this moral labyrinth, it would be him. Bishop Crawford, now in his 70s with silver hair and wise eyes that had seen every form of human suffering, listened patiently as I described the situation in the most general terms possible, never mentioning names or specific details that would violate the sacred trust of confession. "David," he said finally, his voice heavy with the weight of decades in ministry, "you're facing one of the most difficult challenges in pastoral care. The sanctity of confession is not just church law, it's the foundation of trust between a shepherd and his flock. But there's also the principle of protecting the innocent, especially when children are involved." He opened his worn Bible to the book of Leviticus and read, "Do not stand idly by when your neighbor's life is threatened." Then he turned to James. "Anyone who knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it sins." "Bishop," I said, my voice cracking with emotion, "how do I choose between two sacred duties that seem to contradict each other?" his answer would stay with me forever. Sometimes, David, we must remember that Jesus broke the Sabbath laws to heal the sick. Sometimes, love requires us to risk everything, even our own reputations and careers, to protect those who cannot protect themselves. The following Sunday, I preached what I now realize was the most important sermon of my career. Standing before my congregation, looking directly at Robert Harrison's confident face, I spoke about the parable of the wolves in sheep's clothing and the responsibility of shepherds to protect their flocks from hidden predators. My brothers and sisters, I said, my voice carrying a conviction that surprised even me. Sometimes the greatest evil comes not from obvious sinners, but from those who use their positions of respect and authority to harm the innocent. We must have the courage to see past appearances and protect those who cannot protect themselves. I watched as several members of the congregation shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between me and various families. Mrs. Jordan, our women's ministry leader, nodded approvingly, while others seemed confused by the intensity of my message. But it was Robert's reaction that chilled me to the bone. Instead of the defensive anger I expected, he smiled, a cold, calculating smile that told me he viewed my sermon as a declaration of war. After the service, he approached me with his usual charm, but his eyes held a menace that made my blood run cold. "Pastor Clark," he said, his voice deceptively friendly, "I couldn't help but notice that your recent sermons have taken on a rather confrontational tone. I hope you're not letting outside influences affect your spiritual discernment. Sometimes people make false accusations against good Christian men, you know. It would be tragic if such lies were to damage our church family." The threat was unmistakable. Robert was warning me that any attempt to expose him would result in a battle that could destroy not just my career, but the entire church community. He had the power, influence, and financial resources to wage a campaign that would cast doubt on my motives and character. That night, as I knelt in my study, I felt the weight of impossible choices pressing down on me like a physical burden. On one side lay my sacred duty to preserve the confidentiality of confession, the foundation of trust that made my ministry possible. On the other side lay the urgent need to protect Emma, her unborn child, and potentially other victims from continued suffering. The Bible passage from 1 Kings came to mind. How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him, but if Baal is God, follow him. I realized that this crisis was forcing me to choose not just between conflicting duties, but between different understandings of what it meant to serve God faithfully. As I struggled through the longest night of my spiritual life, wrestling with questions that had no easy answers, I had no idea that the choice would soon be taken out of my hands. Events were already in motion that would expose the truth in ways so dramatic and devastating that they would shake our entire community to its very foundations. What happened next would challenge everything our congregation believed about trust, forgiveness, and the sometimes terrible cost of standing for truth when the whole world seems determined to protect comfortable lies. And the revelation that was coming would leave everyone speechless in ways that still give me chills when I remember that fateful day. The call that shattered my last remaining hesitations came at 2:47 a.m. on a cold November morning. My phone rang with the piercing urgency that only accompanies true emergencies, jolting me from the fitful sleep that had become my nightly torment. "Pastor Clark, this is Detective Maria Santos with the County Sheriff's Department. I'm sorry to wake you, but we need you at Community General Hospital immediately. There's been an incident involving members of your congregation." My hands trembled as I dressed, a terrible dread filling my chest. During the 20-minute drive through empty streets, I prayed desperately that my worst fears wouldn't be confirmed. But when I arrived at the hospital and saw Detective Santos waiting for me with Dr. Martinez, I knew that the breaking point had finally arrived. Pastor, Dr. Martinez said, her professional composure barely masking her anger, we have Emma Harrison here again. This time, her injuries are consistent with significant physical trauma. She's stable, but we've had to perform emergency procedures to protect both her and the baby. Detective Santos, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes that had seen too much suffering, spoke quietly. Pastor Clark, hospital policy requires us to investigate cases like this. Emma claims she fell down the stairs again, but the pattern of injuries tells a different story. Dr. Martinez has documented evidence of systematic physical harm spanning several months. My heart broke as I realized that Emma's situation had escalated far beyond anything I had imagined. The psychological control had given way to increasingly violent physical attacks, and now both she and her unborn child were fighting for their lives. "Can I see her?" I asked, though part of me dreaded what I might find. Emma lay in the intensive care unit, connected to monitors that tracked both her vital signs and those of her baby. Her face was so swollen and bruised that she was barely recognizable, and her left leg was elevated in traction. But what haunted me most were her eyes, eyes that held not just pain, but a desperate plea for help that she could no longer voice aloud. "Pastor," she whispered through split lips, "I told them I fell again. I had to. If Robert finds out that anyone suspects—" She trailed off, too terrified to finish the sentence. Detective Santos approached us carefully. "Emma, I understand you're frightened, but we need to know the truth. Your life and your baby's life may depend on it. These injuries didn't come from falling downstairs." I watched Emma's internal struggle play out across her battered features. Every instinct told her to maintain the lie that had kept her alive this long, but the evidence of Robert's escalating violence was becoming impossible to hide. "I can't," she finally whispered. "You don't understand what he's capable of. If I say anything, he'll kill me. He's told me exactly how he would do it, and no one would ever suspect because everyone thinks he's such a good Christian man." Detective Santos exchanged a meaningful look with Dr. Martinez before turning back to Emma. "What if I told you that you're not the first person to make these accusations against Robert Harrison? What if I told you that someone else has already come forward?" The shock on Emma's face mirrored my own. Another victim? The possibility that Robert's pattern of violence extended beyond the Harrison household filled me with horror and a strange sense of relief. Relief that the truth was finally beginning to surface through channels other than my own moral crisis. "Who?" Emma asked, her voice barely audible. Detective Santos hesitated before answering. "Linda Harrison. Your mother came to us yesterday afternoon. She's been documenting evidence for weeks, and she finally found the courage to speak when she realized that your life was in immediate danger." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Linda, the woman I had seen as complicit in her daughter's suffering, had been secretly working to protect Emma while maintaining the facade that kept them both alive. The complexity of her situation, the impossible choices she had been forced to make, suddenly became clear. "Pastor Clark," Detective Santos continued, "Mrs. Harrison mentioned that Emma might have confided in you. Anything you can tell us, within the bounds of your pastoral obligations, of course, could be crucial in building a case that protects both women." I found myself at the exact crossroads that had been approaching for weeks. Here was the moment when my two sacred duties, maintaining the confidentiality of confession and protecting the innocent, collided with devastating force. Emma lay broken in a hospital bed, her baby clinging to life, while her abuser remained free to continue his reign of terror. That night, after Detective Santos had left and Emma had fallen into an exhausted sleep under police protection, I made my way to the hospital chapel. The small, interfaith space, with its simple wooden cross and rows of folding chairs, had never felt more sacred or more necessary than it did in that moment. I fell to my knees and poured out my soul before God in a way I hadn't done since the night I first felt called to ministry. Lord, I prayed, I need wisdom beyond my own understanding. Show me how to honor both the sacred trust of confession and the sacred duty to protect your children. Help me to be your instrument of justice and mercy. As I wrestled in prayer, the story of Solomon came to mind, how the young king had asked for wisdom to judge between two women claiming the same child. Solomon's solution had revealed the truth through compassion and insight rather than rigid adherence to legal procedure. Then I thought of Jesus himself, who had consistently prioritized mercy over religious law when the two conflicted. He had healed on the Sabbath, eaten with tax collectors and sinners, and challenged the religious authorities when their rules became barriers to God's love and justice. Suddenly, I understood what I needed to do. Emma had never asked me to keep her revelations secret in the formal context of confession. She had simply sought pastoral counsel from someone she trusted. While I couldn't betray the sacred confidence, I could encourage her to find the courage to speak the truth that would set her free. The next morning, I returned to Emma's bedside with a renewed sense of purpose. Emma, I said gently, I've been praying about your situation all night, and I believe God is providing a way forward. Detective Santos is offering you protection and the chance to break free from this cycle of violence. Your mother has already shown tremendous courage by speaking out. Emma looked at me with a mixture of hope and terror. Pastor, what if he hurts my mother for betraying him? What if he finds a way to get to me, even in protective custody? What if the baby... Emma, I interrupted gently, remember the verse from Isaiah. No weapon forged against you will prevail, and you will refute every tongue that accuses you. This is the heritage of the servants of the Lord. God has protected you this far, bringing people into your life who care enough to fight for your safety. Don't you think he's strong enough to see this through to the end? I saw something shift in Emma's eyes, a spark of the courage that had been beaten down but not extinguished. Pastor, if I tell them everything, will you stand by me? When the church finds out about the baby, when people start taking sides, will you still be my pastor? Emma, I said, taking her uninjured hand in both of mine, I will stand by you no matter what. More importantly, God will stand by you. You are his beloved daughter, and no one has the right to harm you or make you live in fear. When Detective Santos returned that afternoon, Emma was ready to tell her story. As I listened to her recount months of psychological torture and escalating physical violence, I realized that my moral crisis had been resolved not through my own wisdom, but through God's providence, working through the courage of broken women who refused to remain silent. But as Emma finished her statement, and Detective Santos prepared to arrest Robert Harrison, none of us could have predicted the explosive confrontation that was about to unfold, or the shocking revelation that would turn everything we thought we knew about this family completely upside down and leave our entire congregation questioning everything they believed about truth, trust, and the very nature of evil itself. The moment of truth arrived in the most unexpected way possible. While Detective Santos was preparing arrest warrants based on Emma's testimony, a routine hospital procedure would expose a truth so shocking that it would forever change our understanding of the entire situation. Dr. Martinez had ordered blood work and genetic screening for Emma's unborn baby, standard procedure, given the trauma she had endured. What came back from the laboratory 3 days later would shake our community to its very foundation. I was in my office preparing Sunday's sermon when Dr. Martinez called with urgency in her voice that I had never heard before. Pastor Clark, I need you to come to the hospital immediately. There's been a development in Emma's case that, well, I think you need to hear this in person. When I arrived at the hospital, I found Dr. Martinez, Detective Santos, and a genetic counselor huddled in a conference room with expressions of complete bewilderment on their faces. Pastor, Dr. Martinez began slowly, The paternity results for Emma's baby have revealed something absolutely extraordinary. The baby's father is Michael Thompson. There's no question about that. But the genetic screening revealed something else entirely. She paused, as if struggling to believe her own words. Pastor, based on the DNA markers, Emma Harrison and Robert Harrison are not related. Not even distantly. There's no possible way he could be her stepfather. The room fell silent as the implications of this revelation began to sink in. If Robert wasn't Emma's stepfather, then who was he? And why had this family lived a lie for so many years? Detective Santos was the first to speak. We need to bring Emma in for questioning immediately. If she's been lying about her family relationships, then everything we thought we knew about this case is wrong. But Dr. Martinez shook her head. Detective, I don't think Emma knows. Her shock when I told her about the genetic results was completely genuine. She's as confused as we are. When we brought Emma the news, her reaction confirmed Dr. Martinez's assessment. The young woman who had endured so much suffering looked at us with complete bewilderment. That's impossible, she whispered. Robert married my mother when I was 8 years old. He's been my stepfather for 13 years. How can we not be related? It was Detective Santos who suggested the next step. Emma, we need to speak with your mother immediately. Linda Harrison is the only person who can explain what's really going on here. The confrontation with Linda Harrison took place in the hospital's family conference room. When Detective Santos presented her with the genetic evidence, the transformation in Linda was immediate and dramatic. The frightened, submissive woman I had known for years suddenly straightened her shoulders and looked us all in the eye with the expression of profound relief. Thank God, she said quietly. I've been waiting 13 years for this moment to come. What Linda revealed next would challenge everything our church community believed about truth, sacrifice, and the lengths a mother will go to protect her child. Robert Harrison is not Emma's stepfather, Linda began, her voice growing stronger with each word. His real name is Robert Mitchell, and he's a man I helped escape from a violent situation 13 years ago. I thought I was saving his life. Instead, I brought a monster into our home. The story that unfolded was more complex than any of us could have imagined. Linda had been working as a nurse at a domestic violence shelter when she met Robert, who claimed to be a victim fleeing an abusive wife. Moved by compassion and her own experience as a single mother, she had offered him shelter and eventually married him to help establish his new identity. He seemed so grateful, so gentle, Linda continued, tears streaming down her face. But gradually, he began to show his true nature. The man who claimed to be a victim was actually the predator he had been running from all along. By the time I realized what I had done, he had already begun to target Emma. Detective Santos leaned forward. Why didn't you leave? Why didn't you report him? Linda's answer revealed the depth of her desperation and love for her daughter. He threatened to disappear with Emma and kill us both if I ever tried to expose him. He had assumed the identity of Robert Harrison so completely that no one would have believed my story. And Emma, she was so young, and he convinced her that this was normal, that all families lived this way. The revelation that followed was even more devastating. 6 months ago, Robert discovered that Emma was seeing Michael Thompson seriously. He became obsessed with the idea that she might become pregnant and that genetic testing might reveal his true identity. The violence escalated because he was preparing to disappear again, but this time, he planned to take Emma with him. Detective Santos immediately issued an all-points bulletin for Robert Mitchell, whose real criminal history revealed a pattern of domestic violence, identity theft, and child endangerment spanning multiple states. The pillar of our church community was actually a career criminal who had been living under a stolen identity for over a decade. When news of the revelations reached our congregation, the reaction was explosive. The emergency church meeting I called that Sunday evening was unlike anything in our church's history. The sanctuary was packed with members whose emotions ranged from shock and disbelief to anger and heartbreak. Mrs. Jordan, our women's ministry leader, stood up with tears in her eyes. "Pastor Clark, how could we have been so deceived? This man led our men's ministry, taught our children, took offerings for charitable causes. How many people did he hurt while we celebrated his Christian character?" Others struggled with the complexity of Linda's situation. "How could she bring this man into our church?" demanded Deacon Phillips. "How could she let him around our children?" But it was young Michael Thompson who spoke the words that began our community's healing process. Standing with his arm protectively around Emma, who had been released from the hospital that morning, he addressed the congregation with a maturity beyond his years. "Linda Harrison isn't the villain in this story," he said firmly. "She's a woman who tried to help someone she thought was in need, and when she realized her mistake, she spent 13 years protecting her daughter the only way she knew how. Emma is alive today because her mother never stopped fighting for her, even when it meant enduring unimaginable suffering herself." The arrest of Robert Mitchell came 2 days later, when police found him attempting to board a bus to Mexico. When confronted with the evidence against him, including his true criminal history, he finally confessed to years of psychological and physical violence against both Linda and Emma. But perhaps the most shocking revelation came during his confession. Robert admitted that his escalating violence toward Emma wasn't just about control. It was about his growing fear that someone would discover his true identity. The pregnancy had terrified him because genetic testing might expose the elaborate lie he had built his entire life around. As our church community began to process these revelations, I found myself in the unique position of shepherding a congregation through collective trauma. The man we had trusted and admired had been a complete fiction, and many members struggled with feelings of betrayal and confusion about their own judgment. In the weeks that followed, I organized support groups for those who felt deceived by Robert's manipulation. I preached sermons about the difference between naive trust and wise discernment. Most importantly, I helped our congregation understand that Linda and Emma were victims, not accomplices, in this elaborate deception. The healing process was slow and sometimes painful. Some members left our church, unable to reconcile their faith with the reality that evil could disguise itself so convincingly. Others grew stronger in their commitment to protecting the vulnerable and supporting those who had survived trauma. But as we worked together to rebuild trust and community, none of us could have predicted the final twist in this incredible story. A revelation about forgiveness, redemption, and the power of God's grace that would challenge everything we thought we knew about justice and mercy in ways so profound that they would transform not just our church, but the very hearts and souls of everyone involved. 6 months after the truth was revealed, I stood at the pulpit of Bright Hope Community Church, looking out at a congregation that had been forever changed by our journey through darkness into light. The sanctuary was fuller than it had ever been, not just with our regular members, but with families who had been drawn to our community by the story of healing and redemption that had emerged from our deepest crisis. In the front row sat Emma and Michael Thompson, now married, holding their beautiful daughter Grace, a child whose very name represented the divine favor that had protected her through the darkest of circumstances. Beside them sat Linda Harrison, no longer the broken woman who had lived in fear for 13 years, but a strong advocate for domestic violence survivors who had found her voice and her purpose through her pain. The transformation in our community had been nothing short of miraculous. What began as a story of deception and abuse had become a testament to the power of truth, the necessity of courage, and the infinite capacity of the human heart to heal when supported by genuine Christian love. The journey to this moment had not been easy. In the weeks following Robert Mitchell's arrest and the revelation of his true identity, our congregation had wrestled with difficult questions about trust, discernment, and forgiveness. Some members had left, unable to reconcile their faith with the reality that evil could masquerade so convincingly as righteousness. But those who remained had grown stronger, more compassionate, and more committed to protecting the vulnerable among us. One of the most profound changes had come in our approach to church leadership and community accountability. We established new protocols for background checks, created safe spaces for reporting concerns, and most importantly, fostered a culture where asking difficult questions was seen as an act of love rather than disloyalty. Linda had become our most powerful advocate for these changes. We can't prevent every wolf from entering our flock, she had told the congregation during one of our healing services, but we can create an environment where sheep feel safe enough to cry out when they're being devoured. The question of Emma's pregnancy had resolved itself in the most beautiful way possible. When genetic testing confirmed that Michael was indeed the father, the relief and joy were overwhelming. But more than that, the experience had brought Emma and Michael closer together, forging a bond that had been tested by fire and proven unbreakable. Their wedding, held in our sanctuary 3 months after Robert's arrest, had been a celebration not just of their love, but of the entire community's journey toward healing. I had never performed a ceremony that felt more sacred or more joyful. But perhaps the most unexpected development had been the gradual restoration of relationships within our congregation. The crisis had forced us to examine our own hearts and motivations, leading many members to reach out to those they had previously judged or ignored. Emma, who had once been the subject of whispered condemnation, was now embraced as a symbol of survival and strength. The birth of baby Grace had been attended by what seemed like half the congregation. As I held that precious child in my arms for her dedication ceremony, I was struck by the profound truth that God's plan for redemption often works in ways we could never imagine. This little girl, conceived in love but born from a situation marked by violence and fear, would grow up surrounded by a community that understood both the reality of evil and the greater power of divine love. Linda's transformation had been equally remarkable. The woman who had spent 13 years walking on eggshells around a dangerous man had found her voice and was using it to help other victims of domestic violence. She had started a support group at our church that drew women from across the county, creating a safe space where survivors could share their stories and find the strength to rebuild their lives. I realize now, Linda had shared during one of our Wednesday evening testimonies, that God was preparing me for this ministry even during my darkest years. Every moment of fear, every act of protection, every silent prayer was building the foundation for the work He wanted me to do. The ripple effects of our crisis had extended far beyond our church walls. The hospital had implemented new protocols for genetic testing and family verification. The local police department had enhanced their training on domestic violence recognition. Most importantly, several other communities had reached out to learn from our experience, seeking guidance on how to create truly safe spaces for vulnerable members. But the greatest transformation had been in my own understanding of pastoral ministry. The moral crisis that had nearly broken me had ultimately revealed the true heart of shepherding, not the comfortable maintenance of religious traditions, but the sometimes dangerous work of standing between the wolves and the sheep, even when the wolves wear sheep's clothing. I had learned that confidentiality, while sacred, must always serve the greater principle of protecting the innocent. I had discovered that sometimes the most faithful act is to risk everything for the sake of those who cannot protect themselves. Most importantly, I had experienced the truth that God's justice, while sometimes delayed, is never denied. As I looked out at my congregation that Sunday morning, preparing to deliver a sermon on the parable of the Good Shepherd, I reflected on the profound lessons our community had learned together. We had learned that evil rarely announces itself with obvious signs, but instead disguises itself as respectability and righteousness. We had discovered that victims of abuse often protect their abusers not out of weakness, but out of complex calculations for survival that outsiders cannot fully understand. We had experienced the truth that healing is not a destination, but a journey, one that requires the patient support of a loving community. We had witnessed the power of confession, not just the admission of wrongdoing, but the liberation that comes from speaking truth in a safe space. Most profoundly, we had seen that God's redemptive power can work even through the most broken situations, bringing beauty from ashes and hope from despair. Emma had recently shared her testimony with a group of young women, telling them, "I thought my life was over when the truth came out about my pregnancy and my family situation. I was sure I would be judged, rejected, and left alone. Instead, I found a community that loved me enough to fight for my safety and help me build a new life. That's not just human kindness. That's the love of God working through human hearts." As I concluded my sermon that morning, I offered a prayer that had become central to our community's identity. Lord, give us eyes to see the hidden suffering around us, courage to speak truth even when it's dangerous, and hearts wide enough to embrace those who have been broken by this world's cruelty. Help us to be a people who value authenticity over appearance, protection over reputation, and love over law. The final image that will stay with me forever came during our Christmas Eve service. As we lit candles and sang Silent Night, I watched Emma holding baby Grace while Linda sat beside them, Michael's arm around them all. In the soft glow of candlelight, surrounded by a congregation that had learned to love more deeply through shared struggle, I saw a living picture of God's grace. This family, formed not by blood, but by choice, not by perfection, but by forgiveness, not by chance, but by divine providence, represented everything our faith teaches about redemption, restoration, and the unbreakable bonds of love. My friends, I share this story not to shock or sensationalize, but to remind you that God's light shines brightest in the darkest places. In our world today, where so many suffer in silence behind facades of respectability, may we be communities that offer true sanctuary, places where truth can be spoken, wounds can be healed, and new life can begin. May we never forget that sometimes the most Christ-like thing we can do is disturb the peace in order to protect the vulnerable. And may we always remember that in God's kingdom, the last shall be first, the broken shall be made whole, and love will always triumph over fear. Grace and peace be with you all.